Hello, everybody out there, wherever you are. Today, I want to talk about what would happen if your nonprofit CEO, executive director, or key staff member, or maybe critical board chair left tomorrow. Well, stick around for the next few minutes, and I'm going to show you why leadership transitions create uncertainty and instability and how to avoid much of that uncertainty and instability. So, as you know, when we have a sudden leadership change, it can create a lot of challenges. People are confused. People don't know what to do. People feel afraid what will happen next. They feel more change will come suddenly. Oftentimes, boards aren't sure what to do. Should they step in suddenly and take over? Should they hire an interim executive director? Now, obviously, preparing in advance for a leadership transition is important. The first thing I want you to know is that there's an underlying structure that your organization may have that actually makes you much more susceptible to the pain of leadership transitions. So, what am I talking about? If you have some kind of org chart, or you have your staff organized such that, like, who supervises who is in charge of who, what you have essentially is a hierarchical system of leadership based on who has authority to control other people, to tell other people what to do or how to do their jobs. And this structure is actually very susceptible to leadership change instability. Because in this structure, what happens, let's say Bob is the CEO. In this structure, we think about when Bob leaves, we could replace Bob with Mary, right? So, but Mary and Bob are never going to be the same. Mary and Bob have lived different lives. Mary and Bob have different combinations of skill sets. So they have different combinations of skill sets. They're not going to be the same person. They're not going to lead in the same way. They're not going to carry out their authority in the same way. So when Bob suddenly leaves and Mary comes in, we have not only changed people, but we've actually, if you envision an org chart and you think about the people, like each box in the org chart, which represents a person, each box is also part of the machine, how it all works together. So we're not only just changing a person, we're actually changing out a whole part of the machine for a new part that works a bit differently, or maybe even a lot differently. And that's actually where we get a lot of instability. So the most important thing you could do to avoid the trauma of leadership transitions, whether they are planned or sudden, is actually to change how you assign power and authority in your organization. And I bet you were not thinking I was going to say that, unless you've been following my work for a while. For those of you who have, I'm talking about if you've heard me talk about the leadership blueprint, the concept I'm about to introduce is baked into this leadership blueprint idea. So the leadership blueprint idea is, rather than the parts of the machine being people, we swap out the boxes in our org chart for the outcomes that we want to achieve, the outcomes that we want to achieve. And we define what those outcomes are. And the hierarchical part is not, we can't have one outcome control another outcome, but decisions around one kind of outcome are going to have a trickle down effect. In fact, for those of you watching, I like to turn this whole chart sideways So I imagine the chart is running, driving down a road. So, and reach out to me if you'd like to see a full visual of this. But decisions around the outcomes related to the direction we're going to, right? Which is the right way to go. Our visioning work, our innovation work. Those affections, those decisions around which way the whole organization is going to go, that outcome will affect every other role within your organization. Next down the line are decisions about how fast we're going to get there, right? So if we try to go faster than we have resources for, people are going to be upset. If we go too slow, that's like, why go too slow? So someone needs to be getting everybody going at the right pace, and then keeping an eye out for putting pressure on the organization to get more resources if more resources are needed, if going faster makes sense, moving that next step forward in our capacity, in our speed. And then after decisions around outcomes related to resources, then we have decisions around outcomes related to programming and outcomes related to the actual development fundraising work. So each kind of layer impacts the other, right? We can only run so many programs if we only have so many resources. If somebody decides to get more resources, then we can expand our programming. But just because if we change the direction of one of our programs, it does not mean we've changed the direction of our whole organization. It does not mean we've changed all of our fundraising outcome goals, things like that. So it's we have a hierarchy of what impacts stuff behind it or below it. So when we switch to this model where each bubble in our map of our machine, our blueprint, if you will, is an outcome. And then the people who work in our organization, they can be accountable for achieving those outcomes. And one person can be accountable for just one box, or they could be accountable for 3 boxes, or they could be accountable for everything. Raise your hand if you are the sole CEO/executive director and only employee at your organization, or if it's just you and an assistant. Guess what, CEO? You are accountable for all the boxes. Or maybe you're the volunteer board member and there's no staff and you are the board chair and you are stuck owning all the boxes, right? So you can own as many boxes as you want, potentially, although realistically, owning all of them is not sustainable for very long. So now what happens is when a person leaves, the person who is accountable for the outcomes leaves, but we didn't change the machine, right? We didn't take out a whole part of the machine and swap it for something else. And we can now reconfigure, right? So when Bob leaves, maybe Bob was sitting in charge of 3 seats and he had team members in charge of the other seats. Now maybe Mary comes in and maybe she takes on 4 seats, but not the same, maybe not the same 3 Bob had. Mary gets a unique configuration that meets her skills and talents. And you can reconfigure the team accordingly so that everybody has a chance. To be more aligned with their strengths and abilities and where they're at. And so we have significantly less disruption, even if somebody leaves suddenly. Okay, just a couple more thoughts about being prepared for leadership transitions. There's also some really good practice things to do here when it comes to just how you store your information. Having some organization around where documents are kept, making sure that there isn't only one person who has access to key accounts online, financial accounts. Make sure there are enough people, 2 or 3, so that if one of those people leaves and somebody new comes in, access can be given. I can't tell you how many times I have heard executive directors come in and saying, I can't get access to the bank account. I can't get access to the credit cards because they were under so-and-so's name and they have left. So make sure you have backups in place, essentially. Also, passwords. please, please, please use a password manager that stores your passwords safely and makes it easy for a new leader or anybody who needs access to passwords to come in and readily be able to access the tools you use. In addition, speaking of tools, it's also really helpful to keep a list of the tools your nonprofit uses. Now, you can keep a list and keep it updated in a spreadsheet. You can also just pull your subscriptions to tools, an annual report of all the tools you pay for is a cheat. It's not really cheating, right? It's a hack for getting a quick list of the tools you use. You can even use your password manager that you should be using and see where all the places you log into to help pull a list of the tools you're using. So think about that underlying structure, which is going to do the heavy lifting of supporting you through transitions. Keep a little level of organization. Make sure no one person is a bottleneck for data. As you can imagine, changing that leadership structure, though, will also make sure that no one person is a bottleneck for all the decisions. Unless, of course, you're the sole executive director, which is a position that is possible, but I do not recommend staying in for very long. So preparing in advance makes all the difference. And it can mean that a change in leadership, it can mean that a sudden change in leadership even can be responded to as an opportunity rather than a threat. And I'll leave you with that. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember,